So I'd now like to welcome Kim Radford and Sarah Warner, who will both work in Oxford, and they're going to talk about collaboration. They've never met until today, so which is slightly contradictory. So welcome, Kim is first.
Thank you very much. Just to give you a bit of background, I'm a physio and I've got nearly 10 years experience working in the field of neuro rehab. I've always had a specialist interest in posture management and more recently I've been working for the Specialist Disability Service in Oxford and completing or working towards a master's in that field. So this presentation should link in quite well actually with the previous presentation. We're going to recap the risk factors leading to pressure ulcer development and highlight some key principles of physical management and some simple strategies that we can all use to reduce the risks, particularly in relation to duration, orientation in space, shaping, interference and stability. So we all know the risk factors for pressure ulcer development. I've just simplified these into two main categories. The first being the intensity and duration of pressure. So patients who cannot reposition themselves independently, or those patients who can't feel that they need to move and reposition are particularly at risk. And the second category is the tolerance of the tissues and the supporting surfaces to withstand the effects of pressure without sustaining an injury. The ability of our skin to withstand the impact of pressure is influenced by intrinsic and extrinsic factors. The extrinsic factors of friction and shear are particularly relevant to this presentation. And those risks that are highlighted in bold, so reduced mobility, friction and shear, are things that we can influence relatively easily through implementing a good programme of 24-hour positioning. So I thought I'd start with some very basic golden rules. The first one, if the conditions are the same post-treatment as led to the pressure ulcer in the first place, it will most likely recur. It sounds really basic, but it's amazing how often we see that patients have gone back into their homes and not a huge amount has changed. Secondly, treatment cannot be successful without long-term management. If a considered, timely and consistent programme of physical management is put into place, it could be that the need for expensive and often invasive medical intervention could be reduced. So what is physical management? It's a holistic approach to managing posture, function and movement for those who cannot do this for themselves 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And over the next few slides, I'm going to show just a couple of simple strategies we can all use to reduce those risks that were mentioned at the start. So firstly, duration. We know that the longer a person spends in the same position without moving, the greater the risk of them developing a pressure ulcer. And not only that, but the longer they stay in that same position, the less pressure is actually required to cause the pressure ulcer. But what can we do about this? So anecdotally, we know that regular repositioning is key to managing this risk. This could include simple strategies like turning somebody when they're in bed or encouraging people to lean from side to side to relieve their pressure in the chair. But also it's important to give our patients more options of different positions that they are able to adopt. All too regularly, I see patients who sit in their armchair for most of the day in a semi-reclined position, and then they spend the rest of the time in bed in the same semi-reclined position, just maintained by the profiling bed. So in fact, the pressure is still going through exactly the same parts of their body all day and all night, and not really being relieved a huge amount. So if possible, it would be good to give that type of patient another option, whether that be turning from side to side or just a position for an activity, for example, so they get a brief break, even though it may not be the optimal position, like you spoke about in your presentation. A different posture is still equally as valid. The other option would be to consider use of tilt. which brings us nicely onto this slide. So the top picture demonstrates a person sat upright in their wheelchair and the pressure mapping reading under their bottom. And the picture below compares that to the same person in the same chair but tilted fully backwards. And this shows that just using the tilt can be a very simple and effective method of reducing those peak pressures that we're particularly worried about without the need to get out of the chair. And it does this simply by spreading the loading over a larger area. I often find that people are quite reluctant to use tilt, and particularly to use enough tilt to get the pressure off of their ischial tuberosities. But sometimes taking the pressure map out and showing them their own pressure mapping readings and how far they need to tilt to reduce their pressure can be a very useful educational tool. And as you said, the use of tilt, not recline, is so important to educate patients and their carers. Shaping. So every person is a different shape. And so not every person can be accommodated on a flat cushion, no matter what the pressure relieving properties of that cushion. For example, somebody whose pelvis is relatively symmetrical and level would be weight bearing through both ischial tuberosities and both thighs reasonably equally. So that could be managed probably on a standard flat cushion, but just altering the pressure relieving properties of that cushion to meet their requirements. But not all patients are symmetrical. So if we now imagine somebody whose pelvis is very asymmetrical, so maybe it's oblique and one side is raised relative to the other side, that person would be weight bearing mainly through one bony prominence, so just the one ischial tuberosity, and maybe one thigh. This means that they're much more at risk of developing high peak pressures under this area, and because they can't spread their loading over a bigger area, obviously this leads to a greater risk of pressure ulcer development. In this case, it might be important to consider shaping of the chair. So maybe having a moulded seat cushion or custom contoured seating to allow the person's pressure to be spread over the whole of their bottom and thighs, as it normally would for the rest of us. And it's kind of a bit like an egg in an egg cup. So if we just balance that egg on the flat surface, there's only a tiny place in contact. So if we can spread it a little bit more, then that can really help to reduce the pressure. Interference. This refers to anything placed in between the patient's skin and the pressure relieving surface of the cushion or mattress. And if we think about a lot of our patients with complex disabilities, there are so many possible interference layers that are often placed in between. This could include trousers, trouser pockets, seams, incontinence pads, underwear, pads placed on the surface of the seat cushion, the cushion cover, the hoist sling. Well, that's 8, just like off the cuff, just thinking of what they could possibly be. I'm sure there's many more that you could all come up with. No matter how good a pressure relieving cushion you've provided, it's really not going to make a huge amount of difference if we've got creases in all of those layers. So we can have a big role in educating people about those risks. Stability. Another common problem that I see in the community is patients who've been given a pressure relieving cushion and they then put it on top of their armchair cushion. So now you've got one cushion balanced on top of another, which reduces the stability of the chair and the cushion. This can cause more problems than it solves, really, because now the person's unstable, they're possibly going to slip down in the chair as they try to get their feet to the floor, which would increase friction and shear. Also, the armrests are now far too low relative to the patient, so they're going to find it more difficult to reposition themselves. So although we've given them a very good pressure relieving cushion, this could possibly increase their risk of developing a pressure area due to other causes, so their lack of mobility, friction, and shear. So if we can think about the whole person and where this cushion can possibly be placed, then that's of huge importance. And one key message that I'd like to get across today is not to forget about the rest of the 24-hour period. Our patients spend many hours in bed, So it's really imperative that we consider what position they are in the bed, as this can be equally as detrimental to their skin condition as the chair. Simple solutions like pillows and towels can be just as effective as T-rolls and beanbag supports. And I know we all feel quite worried about using pillows because they're not pressure relieving. But if we spread the pressure over the largest possible area through a really good programme of positioning and 24-hour management, actually we've pressure mapped this and we find that we can avoid those high peak pressures. The other thing is just to be aware, just as in the chair, try to avoid the risk of somebody slipping down in the bed. So that semi-recumbent position can be quite challenging to avoid, but you can use the tilt function in the bed as well. Finally, some common errors that I see in the community are to do with poor chair and wheelchair setup. And these are very easily solved. So if the foot plates are too high, this can lead to more weight being taken through the ischial tuberosities, and so a greater peak pressure there. If they're too low, there could be more weight taken through the distal thighs. We've already mentioned about doubling up on cushions. One-way glide sheets is another bugbear of mine, really, because we really need to think, if somebody's sliding out of the chair, why are they sliding out of the chair? Just by stopping the cushion from slipping doesn't change the forces that are still acting between the tissues. You guys mentioned really well how recline is not always helpful, and a lack of consideration of the rest of their 24-hour period. And just to finish, we run posture courses, which is actually where I started and what sparked my interest in this field. So we run very basic 4-day courses to address some of these things in more detail, if anybody is interested. And I'll hand over to Sarah. Ooh.
Good morning. I just put this photo up just to sort of say to people, you know, that we need to focus more on positioning. Obviously, the dog has got a key position there and is quite comfortable. Not quite sure about the chap, really. So hopefully in this short little session, we're going to look at, you know, raising the profile for more of the sort of the generalist sort of clinician, so that they are aware of the issues, because I think that is a key problem that is happening in practice at the moment. So really, you know, I've worked in tissue viability as a tissue viability nurse for about 10 years, and you know, you get into your little silos of working with what you know and that. And we ended up having a collaboration with secondary care and providing a service of prevention and intervention, which we called Ox Pupis. And by linking in with my colleagues who had that more specialist positioning and posture knowledge, it actually upskilled me to think about the issues that were going on. And I went and got myself a bit of learning. I went to what Kim was telling you about, the posture courses that they do at OCE in Oxford, and actually it opened up a whole new view of what we were doing in our service. So thinking about that, you know, I then reviewed what we were doing as a service. Were we doing it right? Were we considering, you know, the posture and position of patients and not just focusing on the complex pressure damage that was going on? So, you know, the national view, we should all know this from the guest paper, that there's a lot of pressure damage out there. You know, 153,000 pressure ulcers annually. But that's not all complex, and we know that. So actually I was thinking, well, you know, there's a lot out there. You know, I'm feeling that in our service that we actually see quite a lot of complex pressure damage that is related to seating and that. But I didn't really know what was going on. So in January 2017, I thought, well, I need to do a little audit, I need to have a baseline to find out what was going on. And we run the equipment service for pressure equipment in Oxfordshire as well. So you've got to take that into context, that we're not just having chronic wound referrals. And we were getting 62 referrals a week. Also, we were getting emails asking, for advice and things like that. So that wasn't actually counted into the audit. 25 of those referrals had an element of posture and positioning being an issue. And so we looked at the numbers there, and that equated to 40.3% of our referrals for chronic wounds actually, and equipment were actually got a posture element in it, which, was quite shocking, really, because you knew that, there was an issue, but actually we didn't actually know it was that big. So then, looking at those figures, I thought, well, what is the referrer, the clinician who are doing the referrals into us, what are their take on what's happening? And actually, it was quite startling, really, that a lot of them didn't identify posture and position as an issue in it. There was all sorts of things about, long sitting, about what surface they were sitting on, and about their wound. So it was quite startling, really, that actually there wasn't that awareness out there in the general population of clinicians, and it was quite frightening that actually we hadn't really put anything in place to support these people, the clinicians, to actually manage that and be aware of it. So the conclusion of the audit, which wasn't a big audit, and we probably need to do a bigger one, was that there was an over-reliance on high-end equipment to resolve complex pressure damage. And an immediate focus on dressings. So they were focused on the wound, and they were focused about, well, if we change the surface, it will solve the problem. And as we know, that's not how it is. And also, talking to the clinicians, there was a lack of awareness about who to refer to. So not only were they not being that aware about it, that when we had those conversations, it was like, oh, if it's function, I'll have a health OT. But actually, if they've got chronic long-term condition, actually, where do I go? And there wasn't a real clear referral pathway for them to go, oh, if this patient's doing this, I need to go this way. So there was lots of challenges that are out there for general clinicians. I think as well that we need to think about is that when we're looking at transformation and sustainability programs that is all coming in, and they're wanting us to, they're going to demand that we do harm-free care, that we're going to integrate our work in with social care and that, we've got to get our act together, basically. And I think tissue viability as a service can be key in helping to facilitate that. But I do think that we need to upskill ourselves as well to be able to lead people into making the right choices, and how to make them aware that there's an issue in the first place. The other things that we need to think about is how we're going to talk to commissioners, how we're going to sell this as something that they're worth putting their thoughts into it, and how, if they're going to commission that. So we need to be thinking about how we're going to talk to them, how are we going to provide them with the knowledge to make those decisions. And if we haven't got it ourselves, we're going to struggle actually to see this as a key thing, because there's a big, wide, broad remit in the SDPs at the moment about what they want to achieve. And actually we could miss the boat if we don't get ourselves skilled up, basically. The other thing that I wanted just to show you is actually when we do things wrong, because I'm always a half-empty sort of person, always very positive and that. So I just wanted to show you, the errors of our ways in what happens to the patients, because they are the key people that it ends up impacting on. Our decisions and our knowledge make a poor outcome for the patient. This lady had a riser recliner that she wasn't very comfortable in, so she used to tilt it so she could plant her feet more stably on the ground. And also the pressure cushion she was on was a little bit uncomfortable, so she used to put a fleece blanket folded up. She ended up, no one was really very aware of this. No one had actually looked at her sitting in the chair. So actually, no one was aware what was happening until it happened. She got deep tissue injury, and then boom, map of Africa. That's what I say. This lady ended up at 3 months in hospital, so she had an admission to secondary care. She had surgical debridement, and then she had negative wound therapy to help close that up. All of this maybe could have been avoided if, one, as we were listening earlier in the talk, that we listened to the patient and actually found out whether what we'd provided was comfortable, because that was the key problem, and also, that we actually did something about it before we got to this point. Because we'd all decided that actually we provided a cushion, we provided a chair, she must be okay, and actually she wasn't. So I think it's quite sobering to think that actually, our decisions end up harming our patients. And this other one, this is a lady who had a CVA with a dense weakness down one side. She's on a great cushion, to say that in case they're here, but it wasn't right for her. This is one of our standard cushions in Oxfordshire, a nice low profile cushion that we use for lots of people. But actually for her, she was sliding off it, there was no stability and fatigue. By the end of the day, she was leaning right over the arm of the chair, and that was putting her at risk. At this point, we weren't having any damage at that, but this could have progressed on. So I just want to wrap up and say that we need to work collaboratively together. We need to upskill ourselves and make sure that we are aware of how to support people, but we also need to give clinicians a simple way to manage it, because yet another pathway, yet more guidelines, which are great, but when you're at the face of it and doing it, you're not going for the guidelines. So it's how we support clinicians in practice to achieve the good outcomes. I'm really passionate about this, and I'll be really happy to hear from anybody who've already started that process and have already put things in place to support clinicians. So there I am. Thank you very much.
And Kim, I'm very conscious of the time, because we did start this session 10 minutes late, and we're now later still. So I think we need to take questions at the end, and Sarah and Kim are staying here, and you can catch them at coffee. Thank you both.